Greetings to all the fighters, commissars, and all the progressive forces in all parts of the African continent, the diaspora, and all parts of the world. Welcome to today's lecture series, which is a presentation of one of the 7 cardinal pillars for economic freedom in our lifetime. So the economic freedom fighters, which is an economic emancipation movement, has got 7 cardinal non-negotiable pillars which constitute the political program and agenda for economic freedom in our lifetime. These are the pillars which, when the EFF was founded 7 years ago, said we're going to do everything in our power to realize these pillars, and we'll realize them when we are still alive. So when we say economic freedom in our lifetime, means that we must realize all these 7 cardinal pillars in the era of us being alive. So that is the commitment of the economic freedom struggle. So comrades, the other commissars, the officials in the EFF have already presented 5 of the lectures. We are now presenting cardinal pillar number 6, which is massive development of the African economy and advocating for a move from reconciliation to justice in the entire African continent. That is a pillar that we're going to speak to today, and it is a very difficult moment that we currently do not have a sitting head of state in all the 55 political territories called countries in Africa, who is a true Pan-Africanist, who is committed to Pan-Africanism, to the unification of the African continent. And that is so sad, because if you were to familiarize yourself with the ideas of Marcus Garvey, of Kwame Nkrumah, of Julius Nyerere, of Thomas Sankara, of Ben Bella, of Robert Sobukwe, of Patrice Lumumba, of Gamal Abdel Nasser, of Muammar Gaddafi, of all these revolutionary Pan-Africanists, of Haile Selassie, you will realize and appreciate that the only logical direction for the entire African continent is to unite. We have got no other way to defeat our colonization and neo-colonialism except through unity. And we're going to speak to that in terms of where we come from and where we should go as the people, the oppressed, the conquered, the colonized people, the neo-colonized people, the dispossessed people of Africa. What do we do to change the conditions that we are in now? So before we get into that, in terms of what the pillar in the EFF says should be a political program of the economic freedom fighters, let us maybe start with the other section of the EFF founding manifesto, which speaks about progressive internationalism. So that is the ideological foundation of the EFF in the manner that it is. That part of the founding manifesto of the EFF says the EFF's internationalism is premised on building solidarity and working relationship with all movements in the world that identify ideologically with anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. In this regard, the EFF will ideologically and politically support movements that seek the economic decolonization of the African continent. The EFF will also advocate for the free trade across the entire African continent with common tariffs for goods and services from country to country. The EFF founding manifesto also says that the EFF will also advocate for an ultimate integration of the African continent through the erosion and eventual elimination of unnecessary borders. And that is what it says. And then we'll say that this will mean that the borders that exist between South Africa and Lesotho, and the borders that exist between South Africa and all our neighboring countries like Botswana, Swaziland, will be eliminated. this will also be encouraged in other parts of the African continent so that we can lead the African continent to collective upliftment. That is what the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters say. So if you are a fighter, you must appreciate that you are part of an organization that is pan-continental in character. Whilst we are pursuing national struggles now, that does not substitute the fact that our struggle is by its nature a pan-continental, a Pan-Africanist struggle. We take a leaf from Julius Mwalimu Nyerere. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. Mwalimu means teacher. He's a teacher of the African Revolution. He says that African nationalism is meaningless, dangerous, anachronistic if it is not in the same time Pan-Africanism. So we take that leaf from Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, and we also take a leaf from Kwame Nkrumah, the father of proper revolutionary socialist Pan-Africanism. One who just did not preach Pan-Africanism. He practiced it in terms of even his personal conduct, his interaction with all parts of the world. One who, when he became the president of Ghana, influenced a section in the constitution of Ghana, which is still there today, that says that Ghana is willing to forego its independence in favor of a continental government. So it is not obsessed with the borders which in any way were designed by the colonial invaders. Kwame Nkrumah says that by far the greatest wrong which the departing colonialists inflicted on us, and which we now continue to inflict in ourselves in our present state of disunity, was to leave us divided economically unviable states which bear no possibility of real development. Let me repeat that quote of Kwame Nkrumah. He says, by far, the greatest wrong which the departing colonialists inflicted on us, and which we now continue to inflict on ourselves in our present state of disunity, was to leave us divided into economically unviable states which bear no possibility of real development. The fact of the matter is that these things which we call countries or states in the African continent were creation of colonialism, and majority of them are not economically viable in the manner that is self-sustainable and can take us to a different direction. But also we learn from Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Cabral says that we are for African unity on a regional or continental scale, in as far as it is necessary for the progress of the African people, and in order to guarantee the security and the continuity of this progress. That is what Amilcar Cabral said when he was addressing the Conference of African People's Unity, which was held in Cairo in 1961, before the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which will give a clearer context of why it was problematic to form the OAU in the manner that it was formed. So this is a nuanced perspective. It is not a perspective which has been canvassed in many areas. We will then give a clearer understanding of where that comes from. Now, comrades, the pillar that we're talking to today is saying we must pursue massive development of the African economy and advocating for a move from reconciliation to justice in the entire African continent. So in the textual explanation, the detail of it says that those of us, the revolutionary Pan-Africanists, who are in South Africa, in this political territory of Africa called South Africa. Our struggle must be conducted in the following terms. It says, 1, South African state capacity to do big business should be expanded to the entire African continent. State-owned enterprises should heavily invest in the infrastructure and industrial development of the African continent. This should be markedly distinct from the manner in which the Western powers like the US and the European Union and China do business in Africa. Investments by Transnet in the continent should leave massive footprints concerning skills transfer, the development of the communities where the investments happen, the paying of tax, reinvestments, corporate social investments, safety standards, compliance with labor laws and regulations, and the fundamental economic development of these countries. The EFF founding manifesto in this pillar further says, South Africa's established state-owned enterprises and semi-owned parastatals such as South African Airways, the Airports Company of South Africa, Eskom, Telkom, Dinel, Safcol, and other public entities such as the SABC, Infraco, and Centec should begin to invest in the development of the African continent. While avoiding adventurism, these investments should be driven by the narrow pursuits, or must not be driven by the narrow pursuits of profit maximization, but the need to develop Africa's infrastructure, logistics, systems, and communications in a manner that will create and transfer skills, create sustainable employment opportunities for many people in the African continent, that therefore contributing to development. The pillar also says, comrades, and we must be patient to understand where this comes from. It then says that the development of the African continent is inextricably linked with the development of South Africa and vice versa. So the development of South Africa is inextricably linked with the development of the entire African continent. It's only fools who believe that we must only pursue development in these borders that were created by colonialists only and neglect our brothers and sisters in the entire African continent. So our commitment must be to develop the entire African continent. Also, we are not going to have an economy that is highly developed if you do not have infrastructure that links with the entire African continent. So whatever you produce, you must know that you need somewhere to interact in terms of exchange of those produced goods and products and services. So if you ever think that our development must only focus on ourselves only, that is political foolishness. And we must debunk that, we must condemn that at all times, against all odds. And the commitment of the economic freedom fighters says in the founding manifesto that we should develop the entire African continent so that there is no need for intra-economic migration. So if you think that, okay, we're going to close borders and then develop South Africa only, what you're going to have is just the rapid rise of intra-continental economic migration. So that is what it will lead to. So when you want to develop South Africa, we must always have in mind a commitment to develop the entire African continent, and through a system that collectively involves all of us in terms of what we say. The EFF founding manifesto says no amount of sustainable socio-economic development and stability will be realized in South Africa unless the state plays an active role in the development of the African continent. And this is what it says. It even says that In this context, South Africa's role in the economic development, in the development of the African continent, should not be that of being a mere gateway to Africa's natural resources and raw materials. So, you know, there is this thing that Africa is a gateway to the continent. It's a gateway to go and steal resources in the African continent. It must not be so. So we must not develop the African continent through imperial so-called investors who come and step in South Africa like the Anglo Gold Ashanti and then go and steal resources in Ghana, in many other areas where there is production of gold, and mistreat workers there in the name of being a South African company. So we need to pursue a developmental agenda that is going to leave developmental benefits to all the African countries that we interact with. That is a political program that we should then deal with. And another thing that is said, comrades, in the founding manifesto, in this pillar that speaks about the development of the African economy, it says, owing to the surpluses and many sustainable developmental considerations that will be generated as a result of South Africa's state control and ownership of strategic sectors of the economy, government should establish a sovereign wealth fund which will prudently invest in the development of the African economy. This fund will also assist in the insulation of the South African economy whenever there are volatilities in the resource sector prices and when renewable energy resources, when non-renewable energy resources are exhausted. And then it then makes an observation that most countries, including China, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Norway, Libya, Nigeria, Chile, France, and many others have got sovereign wealth funds for these purposes. And then we then say, as we speak, despite massive resource riches, South Africa has got no sovereign wealth fund, mainly because South Africa does not own its own natural resources. That is what the pillar says, that we should also pursue the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. So when we went to Parliament to speak about the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, which was later on accepted by the current government, but they have not done anything about it, we were taking a leaf from the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters. We are always guided by what the perspective of the economic freedom fighters says we should do. So that is how we have then got to then contextualize these issues. I think, comrades, in terms of the pillar, we have given absolute clarity of we need to collectively develop the African economy. The fact of the matter is that as we stand, the global capitalism was built on the sweat and blood of black people, through slavery, through theft of our natural resources, of basic natural resources, of the steel, of the gold, of the diamonds, of the platinum, of the African continent, which was easy to realize because the colonialists had stratified and subdivided the African continent into unviable small nation states. So while capitalism was built on the blood and sweat of Africans, and that must come to an end, it's something else that should happen. And one thing which we must appreciate is that when colonialists arrived in this continent, what they did, they destroyed a lot of African civilizations. A lot of African civilizations were destroyed, and African empires were destroyed by colonial invaders. They wanted to destroy, they destroyed our sense of being, our sense of being. So the Mali Empire was destroyed by colonial invaders. And that was one of the most successful empires in the world. And you would know that most of us only got to know about Timbuktu. It was one of the cities in the Mali Empire. There was a city of Jene, and then there was a city of Timbuktu. So even the person who is considered to be the richest person to have ever existed in the world, Mansa Musa, was from the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire also had a university which had more than 700,000 manuscripts. All of those were destroyed by the colonialists when they came to invade our territory. You will know also about the Songhai Empire. The Songhai Empire was formed in the 15th century from some of the former regions of the Mali Empire and the West African kingdoms. So the Songhai Empire was also destroyed, and it had a very sophisticated forms of governance and bureaucracy. So we had systems in the African continent before the arrival of the colonialists. But also we must mention of the great Zimbabwe empire, which was a significant progress in terms of mining and trade as well. But the Eurocentric narrative, so the colonial education system, always tells us that when the colonialists arrived in the African continent, they found barbarians who did not know how to take care of themselves, who did not have systems of trade and interaction. That is false. We must go and familiarize ourselves further in terms of what got to happen with the destruction of African civilizations and empires. And then that later led to the formal colonization, starting in the 1400s, of the entire African continent. And then these colonial invaders, they subsequently subdivided in a formal way the entire African continent amongst themselves. So these borders that we have in the African continent were a resolution of the Berlin Conference, the Scramble of Africa Conference, which took place in Germany in 1884 to 1885. And when that conference took place, King Leopold of Belgium said that he is very happy to be participating in this subdivision of the magnificent African cake. That is what got to happen. Where European and the American government was in participation in that Berlin Conference that got to subdivide the African continent amongst the powers. And they just gave themselves the ownership of the entire African continent in a manner that it is. So as a result, we've got a continent now with 55 territories, 55 geopolitical territories called nation states. And there's something interesting, comrades, which I don't have any other illustration of the map of Africa. So this is how Africa is now subdivided. We'll speak to independence later on in terms of what got to happen. And also to highlight the fact that the colonization in Ethiopia and Liberia had taken a different form. But in Liberia, where there was an outpost almost of American black people who had thought that they are going to go back to the African continent and establish a new state, and that did not become a successful project in the manner that it is. So now, Africa has got basically 6 regions now, like the 6 regions of the African continent. So in the north of Africa, You have got 6 countries: Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Western Sahara. Western Sahara is an independent nation which is currently occupied colonially by Morocco. So then in the middle here, we have got the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is not a small desert. It is 8 times the size of South Africa. So it's a very huge desert. It is bigger than the entire United States of America. So you have got the Sahara Desert that occupies the middle of the African continent. So because it's a desert, there are no people who can stay in a desert. That is how it is. And then in this part of West Africa, we have got 18 countries subdivided. That includes Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cape Verde, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Togo. So that is west of Africa. And then in the center of the African continent, where Kwame Nkrumah said the official capital of the African continent must be situated, we have got 6 countries, which is the Central African Republic, the Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then we have got Equatorial Guinea, we have got Gabon, and then we've got a country called Sao Tome and Principe. It's a name of a country which majority of you had never heard about. And then in the west, or in the east of Africa, we've got 14 countries, which include the Horn of Africa. So this Horn of Africa. So in those countries, we've got the Horn. In the Horn, we've got Ethiopia, Somalia, and Djibouti, and Eritrea. Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Djibouti. Those are the countries that are forming part of East Africa. But also they include Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi. And then the islands as well are included as part of the East African community, which is Comoros, Mauritius, Seychelles, and Madagascar. So those are part of the African continent. And then in the bottom here of the African continent, we've got 10 countries, which is Angola, Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Swaziland, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So these are the 55 nations and countries that constitute what we call the African continent, and those borders were created by the colonial invaders. And then, of course, the country which we did not mention in the one of the sectors there is the country which is the youngest country in the African continent, called South Sudan, which happened after the secession of the other parts of the Sudan, which is mostly occupied by by our people. So that is the African continent that we are speaking about, that has been subdivided in that form. Now, after years of colonial struggles, it was only in 1957 where the first country in the sub-Saharan Africa. I spoke about the Sahara. So sub-Saharan Africa, it's all the countries that are this side. And there's a very complex history, comrades, because majority, if not all, the countries in Northern Africa, which is Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Western Sahara, have got some association with the Arab League. So in some instances, when it's convenient, they get to be loyal to the Arab League because majority of the population in that other part of the African continent has very close relations with Arabia. And then the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to experience political independence or political decolonization was Ghana in 1957 under the capable leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, who from the beginning understood that the independence of Ghana will mean absolutely nothing if the entire African continent is not liberated. That is why Kwame Nkrumah was involved in so many struggles to liberate the entire African continent. A lot of later on revolutionary leaders in the entire African continent are students of Kwame Nkrumah, of a system, of the education system that was created by Kwame Nkrumah. So Kwame Nkrumah is our leader in terms of the liberation of the African continent. He's our leader ideologically and politically. That is what, comrades, we must all of us appreciate in the significance of Kwame Nkrumah. I want to talk now about the independence of the African continent, of what shape it took and why we are still in an underdeveloped state. We must understand that. Why are we still in an underdeveloped state? One of the reasons why we're still in an underdeveloped state is because even after independence, a lot of the so-called independent African states have got close economic dependence and relationship with the former colonizers. So almost everywhere in the African continent, the former colonizers continue to exercise economic and resource control of the territories that they used to control. That is what got to happen. So we are experiencing a phenomenon of neo-colonialism. So neo-colonialism refers to the fact that colonialism continues, except that black politicians are now allowed to elect themselves. They are allowed to participate in politics. But also have got a huge crisis of illicit financial flows and tax avoidance in the African continent. So the companies, the multinational corporations that are doing business in the resources sector, in oil, in gold, in diamonds, in platinum, in all the natural resources, in fishing, majority of them do not pay taxes in the African continent. In the mining of cobalt, of coltan, which is later on made to make cell phones, most of these companies do not pay taxes in the African continent. And in most instances, they sponsor civil conflicts. They sponsor wars so that they cannot pay taxes in the territories that they used to control before. So the instability of the African continent is because of its rich natural resources. It's a resource curse that defines the African continent, and it is a neo-colonial resource curse that is inflicted from outside in terms of what got to happen. So we spoke about the independence of Ghana in 1957. That was one of the countries to be liberated. And then one of the countries to be liberated earlier in 1958 is a country called the Republic of Guinea, otherwise called the Guinea-Conakry, under the leadership of Ahmed Sekou Toure. He was one of the most formidable Pan-Africanists. And and this country used to be colonized by the French. And you know what the French used to do? So they enacted something called the Continuation of Colonization Pact. I'll speak to that in terms of what happened. And any leader who did not agree to to the continuation of colonization pact was either assassinated or they will destroy everything else which was built under colonialism. Like literally destroy schools, physically destroy bridges. And then this continuation of colonization pact meant that all the former colonies, and a lot of them are still trapped there now, had to meet certain conditions, including using the French currency, including not having a central bank and having a central bank in the France territory, in France. So you don't have independence in the manner that it is. But I want to speak about Sekou Touré, that Sekou Touré was a great Pan-Africanist who said that we prefer freedom in poverty to opulence in slavery, because he said that we will do it ourselves. We do not need the micromanagement of France. And there's an interesting story which we got to learn, comrades, when the leadership of the EFF visited Tata Keifas Semenya and Mama Letambuli. So at some stage during the apartheid years, Miriam Makeba used to perform in many parts of the African continent. And in one instance, when she was performing in Guinea, when Sekou Touré was a president there, he then spoke to the delegation that was with Miriam Makeba and said that, I can see that you guys do not have proper travel documents because you're from South Africa and you cannot go to South Africa because of the conditions there. You are now based in the US. So before you leave here, I'm going to make sure that you've got passports of Guinea. There's nothing wrong with that, so that you do not have problems. Whenever there's inquiries, you must refer the people back to us. We'll take accountability for you because you're all Africans. That is the Pan-Africanism of Sekou Touré. That is the Pan-Africanism which, when the system deposed of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Sekou Touré says, come this way. You're going to be the honorary co-president of Guinea. We'll govern this together, because he was truly committed to Pan-Africanism in the manner that it is. Now, in the 1960s, there's a lot of former colonies of France and Belgium that were given independence by the French Empire, by the French dominant colonial force that time. So that included the Republic of Cameroon. The Cameroon's independence is tragic, because the first president of Cameroon served from 1960 to 1982. His name was Amadou Bouba-Toura. And then he was succeeded in 1982 by Paul Biya, who is still the president of Cameroon today. And there's a dynamic in Cameroon. So there's a section of Cameroon which was colonized by the British. So there's something called British Cameroon. So there's a movement in Cameroon called Ambazonia, which wants to break away from the mainstream Cameroon, which is French Cameroon. So that is how we are characterized in the entire African continent. We are characterized according to our former colonizers, in the manner that it is. So there is no proper economic development and guidance in Cameroon. They were given the independence as part of that pact for the continuation of colonization. In 1960 as well, we had the independence of Senegal, of Togo, of Mali, of Madagascar, of Congo, the entire Congo, of Somalia, of Benin, of Niger, of Burkina Faso, of Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire, of Chad. That also was gained independence in 1960. In 1960, we had the independence of the Central African Republic, we had the independence of Gabon, of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and we had the independence of Mauritania. 1961, we had gained the independence, so-called independence. I'll speak to this now in terms of the context. 1961, we had the independence of Tanzania. And in 1962, we had the independence of Burundi, of Rwanda, of Algeria, of Uganda. In 1963, the independence of Kenya. In 1964, the independence of Malawi. In 1965, the independence of Ghana. In 1966, the independence of, so-called independence of Botswana. And then in 1968, we had the creation of the state of Mauritius. British gave its protectorate some relative independence of Swaziland in 1968, and it took a monarchy as a part of a motion forward. So that is what we got to realize. And then in 1973, we had the creation of Guinea-Bissau, which is part of Equatorial Guinea. So there's Guinea-Conakry and Guinea-Bissau. And in 1975, after the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, which was the main force of colonialism in Portugal, there was then an automatic independence of Mozambique in 1975 because the left government that had taken over power in Portugal was no longer interested in maintaining colonies. And then we had the automatic independence of Cape Verde. And then we had the automatic independence of Principe and Sao Tome and Principe. And then we had the independence in 1976 of Angola. And then there was a creation of the Islamic State of Comoros in 1975 in the manner that it is. And then there was a creation of some relative independence of Western Sahara in 1976. And then Seychelles, 1976 as well. Djibouti in 1977. In 1980, after some negotiations and military action that was led from Mozambique by President R.G. Mugabe, we had the independence of Zimbabwe. And then in 1990, after the efforts, the fighting spirit of the Cuban revolutionary forces, we had the independence of Namibia, which gained independence from South Africa as a sub-colonial force. So Namibia used to be colonized by Germany, but later on Germany, after the defeat in the Second World War, lost the control of Namibia, and then it was handed over to South Africa in the manner that it is. They exercise apartheid laws in Namibia. But after the Battle of Quito Carnival, which was reinforced by the Cubans, the agreement was that apartheid South Africa must grant Namibia independence and then must enter into engagement for a transition in South Africa. So 1994 was the creation or the independence of South Africa from white settler colonial rule. And you would know that in 1961, the Afrikaners who were in charge of South Africa had declared a unilateral declaration of independence from British colonialism. So they became a republic, but in terms of formal, official independence, it then took form on the 27th of April 1994. But none of these independence have led into economic independence. All these countries still have some close relationship with their former colonizers. So that is what got to define all this dynamic. Now, France has signed with all its former colonies a pact called the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. So there are 11 aspects that define that, and we're going to speak to that now even if we do not speak about them completely. Now, the president of France, Jacques Chirac, said in 2008 that without Africa, France will slide down into the rank of a third world country. So the wealth of France is the wealth of Africa. And that is what it is. And that was also said by Mitterrand, the predecessor to Chirac in France, that said, without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century. So when Barack Obama met with all African states, because African governments have got these things of being convened by countries. So you have got a French-Africa summit where just France only convenes all African heads of state and government. You've got a Japanese situation, Chinese one, India, US. So at some stage when Barack Obama was the president of America, he said that the entire African economy is equals to just France only. So the African economy is less than 3% of the global economy. We account for less than 3%. We're actually 2.4% of the global economy in terms of size of the global economy. So we're an insignificant role player. Why? Because our economies are strengthening and building the Western economies and now the Chinese economy. They're all dependent on African resources. That is why we need the development of the African economy, as said in the pillar that we're talking about today. And anyone who stands opposed to such logic just wants to keep us in the state of subservience forever. Comrades, the fact of the matter is that the entirety of us as black people in the world are a lesser race. We are suppressed everywhere. We are insignificant everywhere. We are sellers of cheap and easily disposable labor to the white capitalist system. Global racism is caused by the fact that we do not control and own our own economy in the African continent. So to now stand opposed to a program that says, let us develop the African economy, it defies basic logic. And it must not be what defines all of us. Now, this pact which France has got with many African countries means that all these former colonies of France must pay the colonial debt. And that if they must pay for what France claims to have done during the era of colonialism. It is still there. And what that pact says is that all African countries that were under French colonialism must deposit their national monetary reserves into the France Central Bank. That is why their currencies is called the franc. Like there's a Western and Eastern part of Western Africa franc and Eastern Africa franc. It's a currency name, like which is still imposed to this day in the manner that it is. And France has got the right of first refusal on any raw or natural resources discovered in the French territories. French companies have got preferential treatment in the public procurement and public bidding of any tender in any of these territories. And they've got an obligation to make French the official language. They've got an obligation as well that whenever there's a global crisis, the former French colonies must side with the French. If there's a world war, all the former French colonies are obliged with the continuation of the colonization pact to side with France. That is what it is, that all their militaries must be trained by the French military. So the French knows the military capacity of all the former colonies in the manner that it is. I know that there is an attempt in ECOWAS to introduce a new currency which will be independent from France, but we're still waiting for that currency, if it is there and if it is going to be there, in the manner that it is. So comrades, we've got a situation where so-called independence was gained, but in essence, it is continuing. And by the way, this does not only apply to the French colonies. Check here in South Africa that the British continue to be in dominance of the strategic resource sectors, particularly in the mining sector. You don't have to go any far. Look at Lonmin. Lonmin stands for London Mine, where workers were killed in collaboration with comprador bourgeoisie, in cooperation with Cyril Ramaphosa. Look at Anglo-American, it's listed in London. Almost all our strategic natural resources have to account to the British Crown. And that is the relationship of how the African continent is. Intra-African trade is extremely insignificant, meaning that the exchange of goods and services amongst ourselves is too minimal in the entire African, because we've got a phenomenon of neo-colonialism. Almost all African countries now have got larger trade relations with Europe, with America, with China than they have amongst themselves. Meaning that the little resources that we earn in the African continent, they are the ones who are sustaining jobs in China, in America and Europe. We are not creating jobs for ourselves. That is why it is illogical to could stand against the development of the African economy as called for in the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters. That is what it is. Now, I said I'm going to speak about the OAU. So prior the formation of the Organization of African Unity, you had different engagements. There were progressive Pan-Africanists who were organized in a group which later on became the Casablanca group, because they had met for the first time in 1961 in Casablanca. And those included Ghana, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Mali, and Morocco. So those countries were the ones, and Guinea of Sokoto Toure. Those countries were the ones that said that these little and viable states are not a solution to our future. We need a united African continent. But then the French, who had handed over independence to most of the territories that they used to own and colonize, sponsored a Monrovia group, which was opposed to the unification of the African continent because they wanted to continue to control and micromanage them. The reason why the OAU did not resolve on the unification of the African continent is because there was a colonial hand at play, which wanted these small territories to continue to control. So there was a group called the Monrovia Group, which wanted the so-called sovereignty of small and viable states, and that included Liberia, like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Togo, Tunisia, Congo, and all of those, most of those, majority former French colonies. When there was a liberation war in Algeria, the Casablanca group was siding with the revolutionary forces, but the Monrovia group was siding with the French. So at the formation of the OAU, which we celebrate in Africa Day, I don't know why, the OAU was not the biggest achievement in the fight for Pan-Africanism. Let me repeat that. The formation of the OAU on the 25th of May 1963 was not an achievement in the struggle for Pan-Africanism. It was a step backward. And I'll speak to what Kwame Nkrumah said in great detail in that particular meeting of what should happen moving forward. And then immediately I finish with Kwame Nkrumah, will then say in terms of what should happen now. The OAU says as part of its aims and objectives that it wants to promote the unity and solidarity of the African states, to coordinate and intensify their cooperation and efforts to achieve a better life for the peoples of Africa, to defend their sovereignty, their territorial integrity and independence, to eradicate all forms of colonialism in Africa. Problematic things there. So-called independence and so-called sovereignty and territorial integrity against the advice of Kwame Nkrumah, who spoke in Addis Ababa on the 24th of May 1963 and gave one of the most important speeches in the history of Pan-Africanism. Now, in that address that Kwame Nkrumah gave on the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which were ignored because of the dominance of the neo-colonialists, of neo-colonial forces, Kwame Nkrumah said something very important, and allow me, comrades, to take you through what Kwame Nkrumah said at the formation of the OAU 57 years ago. And that was the caution of what is going to happen or not happen if certain decisions are not taken. Let us dip into the knowledge and guidance, the political ideological guidance of Kwame Nkrumah. He says that on this continent, it has not taken us long to discover that the struggle against colonialism does not end with the attainment of national independence. Independence is the only prelude to a new and more involved struggle for the right to conduct our own economic and social affairs, to construct our society according to our aspirations, unhampered by crushing and humiliating neo-colonialist controls and interference. That is what Kwame Nkrumah said. He further said, the unity of our continent, no less than our separate independence, will be delayed if indeed we do not lose it by hobnobbing with colonialism. African unity is, above all, a political kingdom which can only be gained by political means. This social and economic development of Africa will only come within the political kingdom, not the other way around. Kwame Nkrumah further said that our continent is probably the richest in the world for mineral and industrial and agricultural primary materials. From the Congo alone, Western firms exported copper, rubber, cotton, and other goods to the value of 2,700 billion in the 10 years between 1945 and 1955. And from South Africa, the Western gold mining companies have drawn a profit in the 4 years between 1947 and 1951 of $814 billion. And then he further said that unite we must, without necessarily sacrificing our sovereignties, big or small. We can here and now forge a political union based on defense, foreign affairs and diplomacy, and a common citizenship, an African currency, an African monetary zone, and an African central bank. We must unite in order to achieve the full liberation of our continent. We need a common defense system within an African high command center to ensure the stability and security of Africa. Now, this is very important. In 1963, we had 32 nations that were forming part of the OAU. And Kwame Nkrumah, as part of the suggestions that he says, is that let us form an Africa High Command that must fight physically against colonialism. And not these messages of support and media statements to say we condemn apartheid in South Africa, we condemn Rhodesia's colonialism in Zimbabwe, we condemn the Portuguese invasion of Angola and Mozambique and Cape Verde. He says if we unite those of us who are liberated now, we can drive colonialists out of the African continent far much earlier. And that was not a resolution of the OAU, which we celebrate as Africa Day in the manner that it is. Kwame Nkrumah further said that we need a unified economic planning in Africa. Until the economic power of Africa is in our hands, the masses have no real concern and no real interest for safeguarding our security, for ensuring the stability of our regimes. That is what he said, that if you can't control your economy, the people will not be able to protect the sovereignty which you are protecting now in terms of what should happen. He even said that we must also decide on allocation of where this body of officials and experts are going to be located once we have got a union government of Africa. And then he says that we must get a central place in Africa, which can be Bangui in the Central African Republic, or a town which was called that time Leopoldville in the Congo, which is in the Central African region, so that all of us can gain access to that. And then he said specifically that we should establish a common market for Africa, an African currency, an African monetary zone, African central bank, and continental communication system. That is the advice of Kwame Nkrumah. And in conclusion, he said that, Your Excellencies, with these steps I submit, we shall be irrevocably committed to the road which will bring us to a union government of Africa. Only a united Africa with central political direction can successfully give effective material and moral support to our freedom fighters in Southern Rhodesia, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Southwest Africa, in Bechuanaland, in Swaziland, in Basutoland, in Portuguese Guinea, etc., and of course, in South Africa. That is what Kwame Nkrumah said at the formation of the Organization of African Unity. But his calls were not heeded too. But a charter was adopted that said, let us encourage formation of regional bodies and gradualist approach to integration, and let us now cooperate as independent nation states. It's 57 years later now. The OAU project has dismally failed. By all measure and standards, by all means, the OAU project has failed in the manner that it was supposed to integrate and develop commonly the African economy and the African society as a whole. And one thing, comrades, which you must appreciate is that at all times, whenever there were leaders that began to speak about Pan-Africanism, they were always assassinated or always banished or always removed from power by the colonial masters, including Kwame Nkrumah himself. He was removed from power because he was preaching for African unity. So in the 50 years of Africa's independence, there were more than 67 coup d'etats, removal of governments. And majority of those happened in the French colonies, who now refused to collaborate with the continuation of colonization pact. Assassinations of Patrice Lumumba was sponsored by the colonial masters. And in most instances, because of the hostilities of the Cold War that time between the USA and the USSR, the American government and intelligence always played a role in assassinations of many African leaders. Thomas Sankara was assassinated. A lot of leaders that spoke about the real, true independence and unification of the African continent were isolated, banished, killed by the colonial system. But that does not mean that we must not take the spear and continue with the fight. Let us actually call it a machine gun. Let us take the machine gun and continue to fight for the unity of the African continent in the manner that it is. And of course, in the periods, you know, we spoke about the independence movements. Some were supported by the Liberation Committee, which was created under the OAU in the manner that it is. And then in 1991, there was the creation of the African Economic Community, which was adopted through the Abuja Treaty. You must go and read about the Abuja Treaty, which created, under Article 7, the organs of the African Economic Community, which created the Pan-African Parliament, the African Court of Justice, the Commission for Social and Economic Affairs, the Assembly of Heads of State and Government. That was part of trying to modernize the OAU, but still did not achieve the integration intention. Even the formation of the African Union in the late 1900s to the beginning of the 21st century, which was launched here in South Africa, did not achieve Africa's economic integration. Even NEPAD, which was spearheaded and led by President Mbeki, did not achieve the integration of the African continent because they thought that for Africa to develop, we must have some close and cozy relationship with our former colonial masters, and that will never be achieved in the manner that it is. The Pan-African Parliament has been created, it exists, but it does not have legislative powers. It does not have effective oversight powers over governments. It cannot caution undemocratic practices in other parts of the African continent. We'll speak to the solution now. And then you have got Agenda 2063. So Agenda 2063 was adopted by the African Union and is now setting the agenda of African integration to 2063, which will be the 100th anniversary since the formation of the OAU. What that means is that the current leaders have shifted the goalposts too far off in terms of when we must realize the integration of the African continent. But there's something which is very interesting about the Agenda 2063. We must go and look into it, comrades, so that we're abreast in terms of these key issues. It has got 15 flagship programs, and one is a high-speed train network connecting all African capitals and commercial centers, which is progressive. The formulation of a strategy for transforming the African economy from a supplier of raw materials to one that actively uses its own resources. That is number 2. The establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I will speak to that now. The introduction of an African Union passport and removal of all the visa requirements for its holders within Africa. That is progressive. The construction of a third Inga Dam, the establishment of a single African air transport market, the establishment of the annual African Economic Forum, the establishment of a set of financial institutions envisaged as an African investment bank, a Pan-African stock exchange, an African monetary fund, and an African central bank. And then number 10 is the Pan-African digital data network creation and the development of a common African strategy for the use of outer space technology. Then there's the establishment of an African open digital distance learning university, is part of the Agenda 2063. Then number 13 is the cooperation of cybersecurity, cooperation on cybersecurity. Number 14 is the foundation of the Great African Museum, preserving African cultural heritage and promoting Pan-Africanism. And then the last one is the compilation of an Encyclopedia Africana as an authoritative resource on the authentic history of Africa and African life. So that is the Agenda 2063 in terms of what should happen. But what do we need to do now, all of us? We're going towards conclusion. What we need to do is that we must build a continental progressive movement. We need to have progressive Pan-Africanist political formations in the entire African continent. And that agenda must not be apologetic. They can be called economic freedom fighters in Liberia, in Namibia, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, in all these areas, in Ghana. Or they can be called whatever. But these organizations, as resolved by the Second National People's Assembly of the Economic Freedom Fighters, must be guided by the following principles. One, they must be committed to Pan-Africanism, which aims to ultimately integrate the African continent. Number two, they must be committed to the African agenda, which is defined by the return of the land, mineral resources, and economic wealth to the ownership and control of all Africans. Number three, they must be committed to human rights and gender equality, including commitment to rejecting homophobia. Number four, all the formations that want to form part of this new pan-continental progressive movement must have no association with imperialist forces in terms of political programs and funding. Number five, they must be committed to regular elections and democracy. Number six, they must be committed to progressive internationalism, which we started with. And then the last pillar is that they must be committed to the non-negotiable 7 cardinal pillars, which are contained in the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters in South Africa. And in that way, we'll then be able to pursue an agenda which, in the immediate, must campaign for the ratification of the revised protocol of the Pan-African Parliament. So in 2014, if not 2004, it's only 2004, the African Union enacted the revised protocol of the Pan-African Parliament in Equatorial Guinea, in Malabo, in the capital city, to say the Pan-African Parliament must have legislative powers and its members must be permanent. We need to create the Pan-African Parliament as a proper legislative instrument and begin to pass some of the common laws in terms of security, in terms of fighting illicit financial flows and tax avoidance, in terms of monitoring of democracy and democratic participation in all the African countries. That is one of the immediate commitments that we must look into in the African continent as an agenda. We must also support the building of the economic infrastructure that is going to interlink the African continent. Part of the limitations of intra-African trade is the fact that we do not have the infrastructure to transport goods amongst each other. We do not have the railway, which Agenda 2063 said must be created. So we must support the creation of infrastructure that interlinks the entire African continent in a manner that can be sustainable and must be funded by the African continent. And the Association of Central Banks must reconcile the macroeconomic convergence criteria So we need to have some convergence in terms of macroeconomic planning in the continent. And because now almost all countries except Eritrea have ratified the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we need to push for the industrialization of the African continent, because this Africa Free Trade Area must not mean that Europeans are going to trade with Chinese and Americans freely within the African continent and later on repatriate the profits. Currently, the industries, the mines are not owned by Africans. They are owned by these multinational companies. So if you say free trade within Africa, which does not control its own resources, it means that we're just going to allow free trade amongst the colonial and neo-colonial forces, which are comprised of America, Europe, and China. So we need to industrialize the African continent. But that must be owned by the Africans themselves. And we must be unapologetic about that. And we should persuade our governments everywhere to collectively complete the Inga Dam project in terms of generation of hydroelectricity. A bigger part of the African continent does not have electricity. We should support the completion of the Inga project in Congo so that we can electrify the entire sub-Saharan Africa. And that must be unapologetic in the manner that it is. But also we should promote intra-cultural integration in the African continent. We must begin to appreciate each other's values and understand each other's histories, each other's languages. So the language of Swahili is a language that is the most spoken language in the sub-Saharan Africa, spoken by more than 100 million people. So when we say that we must look into utilizing Swahili as a central language, is because it is already spoken by a majority of people. The other languages are not indigenous languages. Like Arabic, which is spoken by 170 million people, is not an indigenous African language. Like English, which is spoken by 130 million people in the African continent, it is not an indigenous language. But Swahili is spoken by more than 100 million people. We need to fight all forms of xenophobia in all parts of the African continent. And we must be unapologetic about that. That is what we need to then deal with in terms of we must fight for social justice everywhere in the African continent. We must associate with all the progressive forces in the world. Black people must be supported everywhere they are found. The second highest black population after Nigeria in the world is found in Brazil. We must know what is happening in Brazil. We must know what is happening in the Caribbean and associate our struggles with the people there. We must always support Cuba because Cuba supported us during difficult times in the manner that it is. And lastly, we must fight this COVID-19 together. There is progress that is beginning to happen in some parts of the African continent. So let us take these success stories, like the cheaper ventilators in Senegal. Let us integrate that, like the faster testing kits that are developed by Africans in South Africa. Let us subject the medicine in Madagascar to proper scientific testing. If it works, it must be utilized to benefit everyone. Let us get out of this COVID-19 period as a united people. with a common agenda that was spelled out by Kwame Nkrumah. If we do not do that, the people of Africa, we will play a subservient role forever. All of us who are alive today, we will die. All of us will disappear in the next 100 years. And our great-great-children will still be under the service of the great-grandchildren of the white people who are alive today. And we cannot have that. Let us change the discourse of history by pursuing a continental united agenda and understanding that this is a political process that must be pursued in the manner that it is. So all the 1.2 billion Africans must be united under a common system. A common currency is basic logic. It will make it easier to trade. Common laws on issues of security is basic logic because it will prevent us, it will protect us from colonial and neo-colonial wars that are sponsored in different parts of the African continent. It will prevent unnecessary and foolish coup d'etats. So we need to unite as Africans so that we can achieve our true economic independence. We will not be able to achieve true economic independence if we continue to exist as these unviable small states. We must begin to promote African knowledge systems and understand our history and where we come from. Comrades, let us continue to fight for African unity in honor of Kwame Nkrumah, in honor of Julius Nyerere, in honor of Marcus Garvey, in honor of all the revolutionary fighters of Ben Bella, in honor of Sokoto Tore, and let us build, let us protect the Pan-Africanists that are leading the Pan-African agenda in the continent and diaspora. We must protect the Commander-in-Chief of the Economic Freedom Fighters, Commander-in-Chief Julius Malema. We must protect P.L.O. Lumumba. We must protect all the Pan-Africanists that are emerging in different parts of the African continent. Mrs. Chihombo Kwe. We must protect each other. Let us create a global platform. Maybe we must also promote global black economic solidarity so that we do not continue to enrich the whites who are oppressing us everywhere black people are. Comrades, the call for African unity is now. And this, I hope, has been an important contribution in explaining the pillar of the economic freedom fighters, which says we need to move from reconciliation to justice in the entire African continent. Amandla.